Okay, here we go. Settle in, I guess. I should be the one doing that right now. Lying down. Low lights. Maybe watching a documentary about the history of nail manufacturing. It would be safe. Quiet. But no. Instead, you're going to have to listen to another one of my screw-ups. Yeah, let's call it that. Adventure is a very optimistic word to describe the smell of first-century Rome. So, get ready. Because this story begins, as always, with a very bad decision. You know that moment when you know you should have learned to say no? That instant of clarity that always, invariably, arrives 1 second too late? Yeah. There I was, once again, descending the stairs to my grandmother's basement, that same space with the balmy temperature of a dormant volcano, a captivating perfume of mildew and despair, and lighting that can only be described as a suggestion of light, provided by my grandfather's flashlight that, honestly, belongs in a museum. The book? Ah, the book. Of course, it was there. Waiting for me. Like a patient and very, very malevolent creditor. Temps Deviationum, the unauthorized manual of the worst temporal decisions of my life. And as always, because intelligence sometimes takes a vacation and forgets to send a postcard, because my brain, always chasing that click of novelty, solemnly ignored all the fire alarms my anxiety was setting off, because I'm me. I opened the book. The old pages, as dry as my social life, made that classic B-movie adventure sound, and there it was, another spell, another trip, another golden opportunity to question my life choices. I read. Aloud, of course. Because who needs good judgment when you have a holy sweatshirt, braces that look more like a satellite dish, and a brain that collects traumas like they're postage stamps? In Tempus. Flavium, Magnificum, sed, Mortiferum, and the rest of the Latin I pretend to completely understand. The usual whirlwind. The sensation of being sucked down a cosmic drain. The distinct sound of a goat laughing somewhere in the ether, and no, I still don't know why. And bam! The first thing that hit me wasn't the light, but the smell. A complex mixture of dust, sweat, garlic, cheap wine, and something I can only describe as too many people together for too long without deodorant. The second was the noise. A low hum, a murmur of tens of thousands of voices, the white noise of an anxious humanity. I opened my eyes. The sun was strong, hot, the kind that makes you feel your brain slowly cooking inside your skull. I was standing, or rather, being held upright by a mass of people moving with the delicacy of an avalanche. We were on a wide, unevenly cobbled street, and right in front of me, there it was. The Colosseum. And, look, I've seen pictures. I've seen documentaries. I've seen 3D reconstructions. Nothing, absolutely nothing, prepares you for the size of that thing. It's a monster. My brain was trying to process the scale of the Colosseum, but it got stuck in a loop, focused on some guy's sandal which had a terrifyingly crooked big toe. Focus, Ned, focus. The arcades repeated in a hypnotic succession, and up top, the velarium, a gigantic linen awning, was being maneuvered by experienced sailors to create partial shade over the arena. sailors. In a stadium. You could already tell that logic had taken the day off. The crowd around me was a spectacle in itself. Patricians in their immaculate white togas, trying not to brush against the sweaty, noisy plebs. Vendors shouting, offering everything from seat cushions, a necessary luxury, as I would soon discover, to sausages of dubious origin. Children running between the legs of adults, probably picking pockets. It was like the crowd leaving a rock concert mixed with a street market, but with more tunics and a significantly higher risk of contracting a medieval disease. I was pushed, carried by the human wave, towards one of the 80 entrance gates, the vomitoria. A wonderfully appropriate name, I thought, considering what happened inside. The idea was to allow more than 50,000 people to enter and exit in a matter of minutes. A logistical efficiency that would make modern event organizers weep with envy. Once inside, the chaos became organized. Steep corridors and staircases led to the different levels, each designated for a specific social class. Down below, near the action, were the senators and the elite. Higher up, the common citizens. And right at the top, in the wooden gallery nicknamed Menianum Secundum and Legnius, were the poor, the foreigners, and the women. Yes, because in Rome, apparently, being a woman was a social condition equivalent to being a pauper. What progress? I found a vacant spot way up high, squeezed between a fellow who smelled of sour wine and a family with more children than teeth. The view, however, was breathtaking and stomach-turning. I was expecting sand. Blood-stained sand, perhaps, but sand. What my eyes saw was water. The entire arena, that vast elliptical floor, was completely flooded. Millions and millions of gallons of blue-green water shimmered under the sun, turning the world's greatest amphitheater into the most extravagant and deadly swimming pool ever conceived. Of course, why build an amphitheater for fights when you can build an amphitheater that also turns into an Olympic-sized pool of carnage? Roman practicality at its finest. This, my dear and sleepy friends, was the Naumachia. The naval battle. My nerd mind, even amidst the culture shock and imminent sunstroke, started working. How the hell did they do this? And suddenly, the horror took a break, because my nerd brain found its new hyperfocus. Roman hydraulic engineering. The answer was as brilliant as it was insane: hydraulic engineering. Rome was the master of water. Aqueducts like the Aqua Claudia and Aqua Marcia brought fresh water from the distant hills into the city, feeding fountains, public baths, and, apparently, the bloody whims of emperors. A complex system of sluice gates and underground channels, directly connected to one of these aqueducts, allowed the arena to be flooded to a depth of about 5 feet in just a few hours. It was a feat of engineering so absurd it sounds like fiction. Imagine trying to fill a football stadium with water using your garden hose. Now, imagine doing it in 79 AD. They didn't do this all the time, of course. It was a special, very expensive event, reserved for grand occasions, like the inauguration of the Colosseum itself by the Emperor Titus. It was the equivalent of a Super Bowl halftime show, but with real, or almost real, warships and a slightly higher cast mortality rate. As I was processing this architectural feat, the spectacle began. From opposing gates, small warships, scale replicas of biremes and triremes, floated into the arena. They were crewed by men. Not actors. Not stuntmen. They were prisoners of war, condemned to die. Damnati. People whose last act on Earth would be to participate in a forced historical reenactment. Today, they were reenacting the Battle of Salamis, an epic clash between Greeks and Persians. Half the condemned were dressed as Greeks, the other half as Persians. A horn sounded, and the crowd's expectant silence was broken by war cries and the sound of oars slapping the water. It's a bizarre experience, watching this. Part of you, the logical brain, admires the scale, the organization, the sheer audacity of even attempting something like this. Another part, the one that still has some human decency, is horrified. The ships collided. Men with swords and spears jumped from one deck to another. The water, once bluish, began to be tinged with red in specific spots. The crowd roared with every solid hit, with every man who fell into the water and didn't resurface. They gambled. They ate. They laughed. To them, it was entertainment. The most visceral form of reality TV. There were no villains or heroes down there. Just desperate men fighting for a few more minutes of life, to the delight of 50,000 bored spectators. I leaned back against the hard stone, feeling the heat on my back. The sun beat down on my face, and the roar of the crowd seemed distant. It was all so grand. And so empty. The ingenuity to create life and comfort, used to manufacture death with maximum efficiency. A perfect paradox for Rome. They were engineers of aqueducts and of massacres. Poets and tyrants. They created civil law and crucifixion. And there, in that giant swimming pool in the middle of the city, these two faces of Rome danced together. The battle lasted perhaps an hour. In the end, the Greek side won. The few survivors from the Persian side were summarily executed by archers posted at the edge of the arena, to ensure no one went off script. The Greek survivors? Maybe they won their freedom. Maybe just the right to fight another day. The rules were never very clear. It was more about what the editor of the day, the emperor, found most amusing. With the end of the aquatic show, something equally fascinating began to happen. I heard a low noise, a deep creaking from beneath the arena. Slowly, the water began to drain. It wasn't like pulling the plug in a bathtub. It was a controlled, rapid drainage, disappearing through openings in the floor I hadn't even noticed. The arena floor, now wet and stained, began to reappear. And with it, the wreckage of the ships and the bodies. But before the crowd could even begin to process the end of one act, the preparations for the next were already underway. Because in the Colosseum, the show must always go on. The water vanished, and what it would reveal was a secret even darker and more ingenious than the flood itself. A hidden world right beneath our feet. The mechanical heart of the beast. But that, of course, is a story for when the ground is a little drier. For now, I could only stare at that immense bathtub of horrors being emptied, thinking that my musty basement didn't seem like such a bad place after all. You know that awkward moment after a pool party, when the water is gone, and all that's left is a wet floor, a few lost plastic cups, and a sense of regret? That was exactly the vibe, only on an imperial scale and with a significantly larger number of corpses being discreetly removed by a cleanup crew that, frankly, wasn't paid enough. The water from the Naumachia drained with impressive efficiency, disappearing through slits and grates in the arena floor. What was left behind was a damp, dark wooden floor, covered with debris from the mock naval battle. Splinters of wood, a broken weapon or two, and stains that I preferred to believe were spilled wine. The crowd, however, was not the least bit bored. On the contrary, the murmur grew again. They knew that the opening act, as spectacular as it was just that, the opening. I remained there, in my privileged seat in the plebeian paradise, watching. The arena floor, now free of water, didn't look solid. It was a mosaic of wooden planks, with lines and contours that made no sense. It looked like a poorly fitted floor the size of a football field. And then, the magic began. With a protest of wood and the creaking of thick ropes, parts of the floor began to open. Not suddenly, but in a slow, calculated movement. Trapdoors, dozens of them, of various sizes, opened like sleepy eyelids. And from the dark depths, things began to emerge. First, a tree. A whole tree, rising slowly from the underground, its leaves swaying as if greeting the audience. Then another. And another. Scenery, rocks, bushes, fake hills. In less than 15 minutes, the flat, empty arena had transformed into an artificial landscape. A small forest, a hunting ground, had sprouted from the floor like a gardener's nightmare. The crowd applauded, delighted by the trick. And I, the 21st century nerd with braces, could only think one thing: what the hell is down there? The answer, my friends, is the hypogeum. A fancy Latin word that literally means the underground. For the crowd, it was magic. For my brain, it was a shot of dopamine straight into the curiosity vein. The horror was forgotten for a moment. The only thing that mattered was the mechanics of that place. It was the most complex, terrifying, and ingenious basement ever created. The backstage of the greatest show on Earth. As the landscape assembled in the arena, my mind wandered through that invisible labyrinth beneath the wooden floor. It was a later edition, built by the Emperor Domitian. The first games in the Colosseum, including the great naval battles, took place before it existed. Domitian, apparently, thought naval battles were cool, but having a system of elevators to make lions appear out of nowhere was even cooler. And honestly, it's hard to argue with the logic of spectacle. By installing the hypogeum, he sacrificed the floods, but in return, he gave the Colosseum its dark, mechanical heart. Imagine a two-story labyrinth, excavated beneath the entire expanse of the arena. Narrow, damp corridors, lit by flickering torches that cast dancing shadows on the brick and stone walls. The air down there must have been a suffocating mix of smoke, mildew, the sweat of slaves, the musky smell of terrified animals, and the metallic stench of blood that inevitably trickled through the cracks in the floorboards above. A perfume no luxury brand would dare to bottle. Down there, hundreds of people worked in the darkness. Slaves, prisoners, free laborers, all part of the great entertainment machine. They were the roadies of the Roman Empire, and their job was to prepare hell. In a series of cells and alcoves, the gladiators waited. They could hear the screams of 50,000 people above their heads, a muffled roar that must have sounded like the ocean itself. They sharpened their blades, adjusted their armor, perhaps said a quick prayer to whatever god was listening. For them, the hypogeum was the antechamber to glory or death. A waiting room with no magazines to flip through. In another section were the cages. Ah, the cages. Rome was obsessed with exotic animals. The more distant and dangerous, the better. Lions from Mesopotamia, bears from Caledonia, leopards from Africa, crocodiles from the Nile, ostriches, wild boars, wolves, all captured, transported for thousands of miles in terrible conditions, only to die in a few minutes for the amusement of the crowd. The hypogeum was the emperor's private zoo, and none of the animals were happy to be there. The constant sound of roars, snarls, and claws scratching stone must have been the soundtrack of that place. But the real genius, the real madness, was the mechanics. The hypogeum was crisscrossed by a system of wooden elevators. Simple platforms, hoisted by a system of pulleys and counterweights, all powered by the brute force of teams of slaves turning gigantic capstans. They were like medieval cranes, only underground. It was these elevators that made the magic happen. A gladiator could be placed on a platform, which was then quickly raised to the arena level. The trapdoor would open, and boom, a new combatant would emerge in the middle of the battle, to the surprise of his opponent and the delight of the crowd. The same went for the animals. Imagine the scene: a team of sweaty, terrified men had to maneuver a hungry, furious lion into a wooden box. The box was then placed on the elevator. At a supervisor's signal, another team of slaves would turn the capstan, and the cage would rise towards the light. The trapdoor would spring open, the cage door would be opened by a rope mechanism, and the beast would be released into the middle of the artificial forest that had just been assembled. It was a ballet of precision, strength, and constant danger. One mistake, one slip, and the cage handler could easily become the main attraction's lunch. As I thought about all this, the arena's transformation was complete. The scenic forest was ready. The sun beat down on the fake leaves, creating shadows that danced on the sand that had been quickly spread over the wooden floor to absorb the blood to come. The smell of pine from the new scenery almost masked the odor of recent death from the Naumachia. Almost. A tense silence fell over the crowd. Act 2 was about to begin. And based on the setting, it wouldn't be a gladiator fight. That forest wasn't for men in armor. It was a habitat. A stage for a hunt. A Venet show. Then, one of the trapdoors opened again. Without fanfare. Just a soft creak. A head emerged, then a muscular, golden body. A lion. It stepped out of the darkness into the sunlight, blinking, disoriented. It sniffed the air, the fur on its neck bristling. The crowd let out a collective gasp, a mixture of fear and excitement. From another trapdoor, on the other side of the arena, a brown bear emerged, looking equally confused and angry. Then, a pack of wolves, which immediately began to trot as a pack through the fake trees. The zoo from hell was officially open. I watched, fascinated and repulsed. The ingenuity to create that moment was undeniable. The ability to hide an entire ecosystem under the floor and reveal it at the perfect moment. It was theater. It was engineering. And it was terribly cruel. I thought of the men down below, in the darkness, sweating to turn the wheels that brought these beasts to the light, hearing the roars from above and below, trapped between the violence of the spectacle and the fury of the caged attractions. What kind of life was that? Do you get used to the smell? Do you become immune to the screams? And then, a gate at ground level opened. The main gate, the Porta Libidinaria, the gate of death. And from it emerged not hunters with spears and shields. Men and women emerged. Unarmed. Dressed in simple rags. Some were chained to each other. They didn't walk, they were pushed into the arena. Their faces were a mask of pure terror, looking at the artificial forest, hearing the snarls that came from within it. The crowd didn't boo. They didn't cheer. They just watched with a hungry attention. I swallowed hard, my stomach churning. I knew what this was. I had read about it in my dusty, safe history books. But to see it live... to see it live is something else entirely. It wasn't a hunt. It wasn't a fight. It was a sentence. A public execution in the most humiliating and terrifying way the human mind could conceive. It was the damnatio ad bestias. The condemnation to the beasts. And the prey was human. There is a type of silence that is louder than any scream. It is the silence of collective anticipation. 50,000 people held their breath at the same time, creating a sonic vacuum that was almost physical. In that moment, there were no social classes in the seats. There were only predators and prey. And I, unfortunately, had a front row seat to the top of the food chain in action. The condemned, the damnati, were huddled in the center of the arena. The artificial forest that had seemed so ingenious moments before was now a labyrinth of death. The beasts, released from their subterranean cages, moved in the shadows of the scenery trees. A lion here, a bear there. It wasn't a frantic hunt. It was something worse. It was a slow game of psychological terror. I wanted to close my eyes. I wanted the stupid book to pull me back to the mothball smell of my grandmother's basement. But I couldn't. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion. The horror paralyzes you. And as I watched, my brain, in a useless act of self-preservation, began to catalog, to analyze. Why? Stop that, I thought. This is not the time for a history lesson about the persecution of Christians. But the brain doesn't listen. It seeks patterns, seeks facts, seeks anything to avoid processing the pure feeling of terror right in front of me. The damnatio ad bestias, the condemnation to the beasts, wasn't just a death penalty. It was a statement. It was the most brutal marketing tool of the Roman Empire. The damnatio ad bestias, the condemnation to the beasts, wasn't just a death penalty. It was a statement. It was the most brutal marketing tool of the Roman Empire. Reserved for the worst of the worst, or at least for those the state wanted the public to see as the worst. Traitors, army deserters, arsonists, murderers of relatives, and, most famously, the Christians. To the Romans, being a Christian wasn't just having a different faith. It was a political crime. It was being an atheist for refusing to worship the Roman gods. And it was treason for refusing to participate in the imperial cult, to burn a little incense to the genius of the emperor. It was like spitting on the flag, if the flag were also a deity and your boss. Therefore, in the eyes of the state, they weren't executing people of faith. They were eliminating public enemies who threatened the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods, which guaranteed the stability of the empire. Flawless logic, if you completely ignore the morality part. This macabre spectacle usually took place at noon. It was the intermission. The aristocracy, the senators, and the wealthy often retired for a civilized lunch, leaving the stands to the common folk. It was the common man's entertainment. The halftime show, where you were the snack. In the arena, the first scream finally tore through the silence. One of the wolves, fast and efficient, had attacked the edge of the group of condemned. Panic set in. The group broke apart, and people started running, which was the worst thing they could do. Running triggers the hunting instinct. And the crowd watched it all with the same expression as someone watching a nature documentary. Except, in this case, the gazelle was a guy named Lucius who probably got caught stealing bread. The lack of empathy was total. To them, those human beings down there had already been stripped of their humanity. They were figures, not people. They were the personification of crime being purged by the purifying power of wild nature, all conveniently orchestrated by the emperor for the good of Rome. I saw a man, perhaps in the hope of a quicker death, run directly at the bear. The bear, which until then had seemed more interested in scratching a fake tree, rose up on its hind legs and crushed him with a single swipe of its paw. Just like that. End of story. The crowd let out a murmur of approval. It was a good blow. 8 out of 10. Others were tied to posts. A way to ensure that the animals, perhaps a little shy with the crowd, had an easy target. A woman, who looked no older than me, was tied to one of these posts. She didn't scream. She just looked at the sky, her lips moving in a silent prayer. A leopard, released from a nearby trapdoor, circled her for a while before attacking. I looked away. I focused on the pattern of the stones of my seat, on my neighbor's smell, on anything. But I still heard it. The sound that followed was not a long scream. It was short, muffled, and then, the horrible noise that I will not describe. It's a strange thing, the human mind. Mine, at least. Even in the midst of horror, it seeks patterns, seeks explanations. I thought of the Christian martyrs. the stories I'd read about Saint Ignatius of Antioch, who was supposedly martyred here. Propaganda works both ways. For Rome, it was a warning. For the Christians, it became a symbol of supreme faith, of sacrifice. Dying in the Colosseum became the VIP ticket to paradise. A powerful narrative. But the reality, right in front of me, had nothing glorious about it. There were no choirs of angels. Just the smell of blood and the terrified silence of the next victims. This persecution of Christians, by the way, was not a constant event as Hollywood movies like to portray. It happened in waves. It depended on the emperor, the political situation, whether there was a convenient scapegoat to blame for a fire, a plague, or a military defeat. For emperors like Nero or Diocletian, Christians were an easy target. For others, they were just another strange cult from the East that was best left alone. The bureaucracy of genocide is inefficient, after all. The show lasted maybe half an hour. The time it took for all the pieces to be removed from the board. When the last condemned person fell, a heavy silence settled in again. And then, as if nothing had happened, the next phase began. Bizarrely dressed figures entered the arena. One of them wore a mask of Charon, the mythological ferryman of the dead. He prodded each body with a mallet to ensure they were truly dead. Another, dressed as the god Mercury, touched the bodies with a red-hot metal poker, just to be sure. Workplace safety was paramount. Then, the cleanup crew, the libetanarii, entered with their stretchers. With practiced efficiency, they removed the bodies, or what was left of them, and dragged them out through the Porta Libetanaria, the same gate through which the condemned had entered. The revolving door of death. The surviving animals were rounded up, guided back into the subterranean passages by brave, or stupid, handlers with whips and poles. The scenery was dismantled and lowered back into the hypogeum. And finally, slaves entered with rakes and wheelbarrows full of fresh sand. They covered the dark stains, leveled the ground, and in a few minutes, the arena was clean. Immaculate. As if nothing had happened. Ready for the afternoon's main event. That, for me, was the scariest part. The normality. The speed with which the horror was erased, sanitized, forgotten. Human life was cheap, and the public's memory was short. The show had to go on. I felt exhausted. Not physically, but mentally. A part of me was disgusted with humanity. Another part, a part one hate to admit, was beginning to understand the dark logic of it all. The power, the control, the spectacle. It's a powerful drug. And Rome was completely addicted. The sun was already past its peak. The air was hot and heavy. The smell of sand and blood still lingered. And I knew the day wasn't over yet. The gladiators were coming. At least they would have a sword. It was what the Romans called a fair chance. If the Damnatio ad Bestias was the halftime horror show, what came next was the main event. The main course. The reason most of those 50,000 people were really there. The dust of fresh sand had barely settled over the dark stains, and the crowd's energy changed completely. The tense silence was replaced by an excited roar, the kind of noise you hear when the home team takes the field. And, In a way, that's exactly what it was. The sound of horns echoed through the amphitheater, a metallic, triumphant sound. The Porta Triumphalis, the gate opposite the one of death, opened, and the Pompa, the grand procession, began. In front came the lictors, carrying the bundles of rods that symbolized the power of Rome. Then, musicians, and then the editor, the sponsor of the games, today, a rich senator looking to score some popularity points. He waved to the crowd like a politician on the campaign trail, which, essentially, he was. And, finally, them. The gladiators. They didn't enter in their combat armor. They entered in ornate, polished parade helmets and breastplates, shining under the afternoon sun. They marched in formation, an image of discipline and power. They were the rock stars of Rome, the elite athletes, the men whose names were graffitied on the city walls. They took a lap around the arena, stopping in front of the editor's box. They raised their arms in a salute. My nerd brain expected to hear the famous phrase, Ave, Caesar, morituri te salutant. Hail, Caesar, we who are about to die salute you. It's a great line. Dramatic. Unforgettable. Too bad it's probably a historical exaggeration. It was only recorded a single time, and it was spoken by condemned men in a naval battle, not by professional gladiators in the Colosseum. But hey, why let historical accuracy ruin a good cliché? What they did was take an oath, promising to fight bravely. And then, they returned to the underground to exchange their party armor for their work equipment. As we waited, I looked at the people around me. They argued, gambled, shouted the names of their favorites. And it got me thinking, who are these men? The image we have is of helpless slaves, thrown into the arena to die. The reality, as always, is much more complicated. Yes, many were slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals sentenced to fight in the arena instead of being executed in some other way. But many, perhaps even the majority in certain periods, were volunteers. Free men, called octorati, who signed a contract with a lanista, the owner of a gladiator school, or ludus. They renounced their citizenship for a set period, in exchange for payment, fame, and, for many, a way out of crushing debt. They were an investment. A well-trained gladiator was expensive. The lanista paid for his housing, his food, a diet rich in carbohydrates, like barley, to create a layer of fat that protected vital organs, his training, and his medical care. The last thing the owner wanted was for his valuable fighter to die. Death was bad for business. Therefore, most fights were not to the death. It was a regulated combat sport. There were referees, the summa judice, who could stop the fight, declare a winner, or a draw. The goal was to fight until one of the opponents surrendered, usually by raising a finger, ad digitum, exhausted or injured. Death, sine missium, a fight without mercy, was rare. It happened, of course. But it was the exception, not the rule. The life of a gladiator was brutal and short, but it wasn't a guaranteed suicide. It was a career. A terrible career, but a career nonetheless. The first two combatants returned to the arena. The murmur turned into a roar. The final bets were placed. The opening fight was a classic, a Retiarius against the Secutor. The perfect clash of styles, like a sumo wrestler versus a ninja. The Retiarius, the net man, was the personification of agility. He wore almost no armor, just a shoulder and arm guard, gallerus and manica. His weapons were a trident, a dagger, and his main tool, a heavy net. His strategy was to keep his distance, tire out his opponent, and trap him in the net for the final blow. His opponent, the Secutor, the pursuer, was the opposite. A walking fortress. He wore heavy armor, a large rectangular shield, scutum, and a short sword, the gladius. His helmet was his most striking feature, smooth, round, with only 2 small eye holes, designed specifically so the Retiarius's net would slide off it without getting caught. His strategy: close the distance and use his strength and protection to dominate the fight. The fight began. The Retiarius danced around the arena, light on his feet, twirling the net. The Secutor advanced slowly, methodically, shield raised, trying to corner his opponent. It was a game of cat and mouse. The Retiarius threw the net. The Secutor ducked under it, and the net fell to the sand. And that's when the outside world vanished. The smell, the crowd, the fact that I was 2 millennia from home, everything disappeared. My brain became obsessed with the dance, the tactics of the confrontation. What was the ideal range for the net? What was the angle of attack for the trident? I was no longer a scared time traveler. I was a combat analyst, completely absorbed. And that realization scared me. I was becoming one of them. A spectator. The sound of the trident striking the shield was dry and heavy. The skill was undeniable. Every move was calculated. Years of training summarized in those few square meters of sand. I found myself holding my breath, no longer thinking of the horror, but of the tactics. And that realization scared me. I was becoming one of them. A spectator. Finally, the Retiarius made a mistake. He stumbled while backing away. It was enough. The Secutor advanced, using the weight of his shield to knock the net man down. He placed a foot on his fallen opponent's chest and raised his sword. The Retiarius, defeated, raised a finger. He surrendered. And now, the real drama. The Secutor looked at the editor. The editor looked at the crowd. The fate of the fallen man was in the hands of 50,000 people. Hands went up, waving white handkerchiefs. They wanted him to be spared. He fought well. It was a good fight. Why kill a golden goose when you can have it fight again on the next holiday? The editor, reading the mood of the crowd, raised his hand. The verdict was Mrs. Spared. The Secutor removed his foot from his opponent's chest, and the Retiarius, humiliated but alive, got up and limped out of the arena. The victor took a victory lap, receiving the applause. I watched a few more fights. A Thraex, with his small shield and curved sword, against a fish-crested Murmillo. 2 gladiators of the same class facing each other in a demonstration of pure skill. The afternoon wore on, the sunlight turning more golden, longer. The smell of sweat and sand mixed with the smell of wine and food from the stands. I was tired and strangely empty. The initial shock had turned into an analytical stupor, which in turn was becoming a resigned boredom. I had seen enough. I had seen the engineering, the horror, the skill. I just wanted to go home. To my quiet room. To a world where entertainment didn't involve public executions. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky orange and purple behind the top rim of the Colosseum. The last fights were ending. The crowd began to disperse, leaving behind a trail of food scraps, cushions, and trash. The flow of people exiting through the vomitoria was just as efficient as their entry. I stood up, my legs stiff from sitting on stone for so long. I started down the steep stairs, following the flow. I looked at the ground, at the debris. A fruit peel here, a piece of bread there. And then, I saw it. Tucked under one of the stone benches, as if someone had accidentally kicked it there. It was dark, rectangular, with a leather binding I knew all too well. It looked as absurdly out of place as I did. My heart leaped. There, amidst the trash of a first-century death spectacle, was my ticket out. The book. Temps Deviationum. My brain took a second to process. Between a discarded leather sandal and what looked like a chicken leg bone, there it was. My passport out of this madhouse of stone and sand. The book. The dark leather cover seemed to absorb the faint evening light, a small black hole of normalcy in a universe of insanity. My first instinct was to run. But I forced myself to stop. I was a gangly, red-headed kid, wearing a sweatshirt in 100-degree heat and braces that could pick up radio signals from Jupiter. Running would only attract the kind of attention that ends with a spear in your back. So I took a deep breath and blended into the stream of people. I walked with the slowness of a zombie, down the steps, approaching the bench where the book lay. I feigned a stumble, an Oscar-worthy performance, and knelt down to tie my sneaker, which, obviously, was not untied. With one hand, I fixed the non-existent bow. With the other, I slid it across the dust and grabbed the familiar spine of the Temps Deviationum. It was heavy. Solid. Real. I hid the book inside my sweatshirt and stood up. No one noticed. They were all too busy, arguing about the fights, complaining about lost bets, or simply trying to find the exit. With the book held securely against my chest, I paused for one last moment at the mouth of a vomitorium. I looked back at the arena. The sun had already set, and workers were lighting torches in large braziers around the top edge, casting a flickering, orange glow over the vast, empty space. It was beautiful and ghostly. The newly raked sand looked clean and pure in the firelight. But I knew what had happened there. On this very day, that floor had been an artificial ocean for a deadly naval battle. It had been a scenic forest for an execution by wild animals. And it had been the stage for skilled men to fight for their lives and for glory. All in the same place. It was a stadium, a theater, a zoo, a courthouse, and a cemetery, all in one. The Colosseum wasn't just a building. It was a summary of Rome. The engineering genius to flood the arena. The cruelty of the damnatio ad bestias. The discipline and celebrity worship of the gladiators. The ability to create the most sublime beauty and the most abject brutality, and present them both as part of the same entertainment package. They were brilliant. And they were monsters. And, most of the time, they were both at once. And us? Are we so different? We condemn their bloodlust while we watch fabricated dramas on TV and delight in the public breakdown of strangers on social media. They had the Colosseum. We have the internet. Different venues, same human thirst for a good show, as long as the suffering isn't ours. The technology changes, but the audience, not so much. I shook my head, trying to get rid of these thoughts. Cheap philosophy wasn't going to get me home. I needed a dark, quiet place. I found a service corridor, away from the main flow. It smelled of damp stone and something sour I preferred not to identify. Behind some broken wine amphory, there was a small niche in the wall, dark enough. It was the best I was going to get. I took out the book. My hands were shaking a little, from exhaustion and adrenaline. I opened to a random page, hoping to find the return spell. And there it was. Regressus ad initium. The eject button. I didn't read with clarity or purpose. I mumbled the words like a bored teenager reading an instruction manual. Regressus, domum, ad meus locus. Enough death for today, please. The last part wasn't Latin, but I thought it added a personal touch. The effect was instantaneous. The torchlight in the corridor began to stretch and contort. The smell of damp stone was replaced by the familiar smell of dust. The sound of the distant crowd dissolved into the low, steady hum of an old freezer. Bam! I was back. On my knees, on the cold concrete floor of my grandmother's basement. The silence was the most wonderful thing I had ever heard. The only light came from the bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air was still and musty. It was paradise. The book fell from my hand to the floor with a dull thud. I didn't even care. I just stayed there for a minute, soaking in the glory of being in a place where the biggest threat was a spider or the risk of tetanus. Finally, I got up. My whole body ached. I was filthy, sweaty, and I was sure I smelled like first-century Rome, a fragrance that wouldn't be a bestseller. I threw the book onto an old, dusty couch, promising myself, for the 11th time, that I would never touch that thing again. That I would burn it. Bury it. Throw it into a volcano. A promise that I knew, deep in my tired soul, I was not going to keep. I went up the stairs, each step an effort. I opened the door and the kitchen light blinded me. My mom was there, at the table. She looked at me, at my dirty clothes, at my pale face. She raised an eyebrow. "Where have you been? And what is that smell?" "Great. I survived naval battles, lions, and gladiators only to now have to explain why I'm covered in dust and smell like ancient history. Sometimes, real life is the true challenge. Now, excuse me. I have about a 3-hour shower to take and a full day of historical trauma to try and repress before I sleep. I recommend you do the same. Not the trauma part, of course. The relaxing part. The only battle you need to face now is against insomnia. And after what I've told you, Let's just say I've armed you with plenty of ammunition for it. If you close your eyes and see a trapdoor opening in your bedroom floor, relax. It's probably not a lion. Probably. Good night. Oh, and the part one hate the most. The protocol. If my historical misfortune amuses you, I guess you should subscribe to the channel. Every like is a little push for the book to throw me into another era without basic sanitation. And if you activate the bell, just consider it the horn that announces the next massacre. I mean, the next story. Now seriously, I'm off to my shower. Do me a favor and don't send me to the Middle Ages next week. Please.